Tonight on Newsnight Scotland, the debate on what an independent Scotland might be like finally gets radical with a bold plan for a more socialist nation. Good evening. A high-wage, high-skill, high-tax economy, a full cradle-to-grave universal welfare system, and more parts of the economy and public ownership. Those are the bones of what the Jimmy Reid Foundation is proposing for an independent Scotland in its Common Weal project. It seems a long way from the SNP's softly approach with its emphasis on what will stay the same. Yet the government has welcomed the paper and even invited its authors to make a presentation to MSPs at an SNP away day next month. So is this a vision that could persuade voters to back independence? Andrew Black reports.
Imagine a Scotland which has grown to be wealthier and fairer, with an expanded economy and a radical new approach to delivering public services.
There will be no vandalism.
Is it pie in the sky or an achievable vision of the nation's future?
The world is watching us, and it's our responsibility to conduct ourselves responsibly and with dignity and with maturity.
Trade union activist Jimmy Reid spent much of his life fighting for equality, and now the think tank which bears his name has been seeking to bring a new dimension to the debate on Scotland's future. The Jimmy Reid Foundation's Common Weal project starts with the premise that 30 years of conflict and competition in UK public policy has driven a wedge through society. So could places like Norway serve as the starting point for change? The country's higher wage, higher tax economy aims to drive down inequality while delivering high quality public services. But is that kind of model really achievable over here?
This is definitely not a utopian ideal. It's a practical method of trying to see how we might have a better society. Now, if other people can do it, you've got to ask yourself why we can't. It's either the politicians haven't had the political will, the forces that are resisting it have been too strong, or perhaps they just haven't had the political skills to do it. This is a challenge to them to say, we're going to lay out some blueprints, we're going to do some investigation and some research to show the steps that are required to get us towards a society that we'll call the Common Weal. We're just going to challenge them to take it on and to take on the interests that might be against that.
You'll hear the phrase Common Weal used a lot in political life. In fact, the Scottish Government already has its own version.
We have made a conscious decision to provide certain core universal services, rights or benefits, some of which are no longer prioritised by political leaders elsewhere, such as free university tuition, free prescriptions, free personal care for the elderly, and a guarantee of no compulsory redundancies across the public sector. We do this because we believe that such services benefit the common weal of Scotland.
The SNP will be debating the Jimmy Reid Foundation's paper at its next conference, but how likely is it that the party would back tax rises as a way to a fairer economy?
It's not about being exactly the same as any other country, whether that's Finland, Norway, Switzerland or Ireland. It's about the possibilities that independence brings. We can choose a future which has the best bits from other countries that we want to have in our country, in our future, but we can invest in our young people, we can protect our old people, we can make sure that people who are disabled and people who are living in poverty have a proper and confident and successful future.
As the independence referendum approaches, the political parties are each working on their own offer for the future. Will that include making Scotland more Nordic, or is it a vision which is beyond the nation's grasp?
Well, I'm joined now by the director of the Jimmy Reid Foundation, Robin McAlpin, by Ross Martin of the Centre for Scottish Public Policy, and from Edinburgh by David Torrance, author of several political books, including a biography of Alex Salmond and an examination of Thatcherism in Scotland. Well, look, Robin McAlpin, first of all, just picking up on something that Stuart Maxwell was saying there, where he said, in an independent Scotland, we could pretty much pick the best of what we wanted. I'm not sure that's quite what you mean in your idea that you put forward in your Common Weal paper. It's much more of a package, isn't it?
Well, what we've done is a package of the best ideas and the best approaches that we can find in a number of countries, particularly in Europe, but also in other places in the world. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to say, if you can generate the right kind of economy that creates the right kind of jobs, and you can get the right kind of good wages and the right kind of tax, then your public services and your public finances sort themselves out and you have strong social cohesion. There's lots of different models. There's not a single Nordic model, so we're not suggesting there's one blueprint and this is how it has to be done. But the basic structure of this is we have to get a labour market which creates good jobs, not just any jobs. We can't keep going with low-paid jobs where people don't pay taxes and therefore the public services are permanently struggling to try and keep themselves afloat. So there's a general approach and there's a general model for how we do this, but we're developing it in a number of different ways as to which specific policies you would use.
Right. What do you make of this?
Well, first of all, Gordon, it's important to recognise that we need more policy debate in Scotland rather than less.
And so it is. We should mark that because even some commentators who would consider themselves, I think, to be right of centre, have said, "Look, this is great. You know, this is a bit more interesting than the usual nonsense we get to debate every day."
Yeah, and we need to have policy debate across the spectrum. And it's great to see the Jimmy Reid Foundation coming in at their particular part of the spectrum. Obviously, we operate across the whole spectrum, but we need to fill in some of the detail in some of those aspects, either on the left or on the right. So it's great to get that debate going, particularly as we go into next September.
Right. The big hard sell, Robin McAlpin's pretty upfront about admitting that his policies would need higher taxes. That's a pretty hard sell, isn't it?
It is it's a hard sell at the macro level, but there are examples of the Scottish public voting for higher tax on occasion. You know, if you think back to the original referendum and the second question, the second question was varying tax either up or down.
It was a possibility of tax rather than higher tax.
Not used, but there was a possibility and people voted for that possibility. Business improvement districts are essentially asking businesses in a local area to contribute more to the common good in terms of the business environment. And there are a number of other occasions where people, if they see the benefit of changing the level of taxation or changing the contribution they make to public services, say, then they're quite willing to consider that and look at that in a mature and reflective way, rather than just a knee-jerk reaction against it.
David Torrance, are we too glib in assuming that people will not vote for some sort of system which will inevitably mean higher taxes?
I think it's extremely unlikely, and I'm quite struck that the examples Ross just came up with are not terribly convincing. The best example we have in recent years was the first election to the Scottish Parliament in 1999, when the SNP campaigned on precisely that, the penny for Scotland. They said they would raise the basic rate, the Scottish variable rate, by 1 pence and plough it into frontline public services, and the SNP didn't win that election. Now, I think it's going a bit too far to argue that they didn't win that election because they said they'd put up tax, but nevertheless, it is now seared in the sort of collective SNP consciousness, and particularly Alex Salmond, that going into any election, and particularly an independence referendum, pledging higher taxes is political suicide.
All right, well, hang on. You give Robin McAlpin a chance to reply to that. I mean, people will just say no.
Well, there's two important things to this. First of all, is this myth about tax being unpopular cannot be sustained by any evidence, because, yes, the SNP didn't win the first election, and then they dropped their penny for Scotland policy, and in the next election they did significantly worse. So if the penny for Scotland was the problem, what happened when they dropped it? But more to the point, what we're talking about here isn't just about raising tax rates. This is the most important thing we're trying to get across here. We have a labour market in Scotland where that virtuous zone of, say, £25,000 to £35,000 salaries, where people are able to pay their taxes and live secure lives, only 1 in 5 working Scots is in that category. 3 out of 5 working Scots lives on under £25,000 a year, and 1 in 5 is above. If we had people in proper wages, they'd be paying their tax.
Right, but you talk about creating an economy based on something which you yourself compared to the Mittelstand in Germany, the sort of huge swathe of smallish to medium-sized manufacturing industries that are the backbone of the German economy. What I'm not clear from is if you have any ideas about how you get there from where we are now, because this is a historical tradition in Germany. It's very difficult just to say, oh, we'll do that.
Well, it's not going to happen overnight. But I think the important thing to say here is...
But it's not clear you've got any proposals for how you would actually get from here to there.
We're about 6 to 8 weeks to have a major paper coming out in this. But the basics of what we're saying here is the people of Scotland have largely not done well out of the last 20 years personally. But the same is true of Scottish Indigenous business base. We have favoured low-pay inward investment employers, supermarkets, large multinational chains that pay low wages, which means that people have low pay and the Scottish industry base gets squeezed out. The big scandal in corporation tax in Scotland is why Scottish companies pay a higher rate than multinationals who don't pay their tax.
Well, Ross,
so if we load the dice for our companies, we can do that.
We're not taking "I've got a paper coming out in 6 to 8 weeks' time" as an excuse. That's no good at all. This is the problem, isn't it? I mean, I'm sure David Torrance and many others would welcome the idea that we had a very strong manufacturing economy based on small and medium enterprises. It's how you get there that's the problem.
But the problem in talking about it is that it's not a polar issue, black and white. It's not. You can't take a blanket view across the whole of the economy. You can't take a blanket view across the whole of public opinion. There needs to be a much more nuanced debate about what works and what doesn't work. And you need to have a much more mixed bag across the economy. So if more cooperatives, for example, which is one of the aspects of the Jimmy Reid proposals, if more cooperatives is a way of slimming down the public sector in Scotland, then let's talk about that. If more social enterprise or more SMEs is a way of slimming down the public sector, then let's talk about that. But let's have a proper discussion about it.
But the flip side of the proposal is you have an economy less based on consumerism. I mean, they explicitly say fewer retail outlets and so on. I'm not sure people are going to buy that either.
I think trying to force the issue in that way is probably where it wanders and where we depart from each other.
All right. Well, I'm curious, David Torrance, on your take on this, because, I mean, for example, if you want to have an entire economy which is based on small and medium enterprises and not based on consumerism, there are certain tax changes you would have to make, aren't there? The most obvious one would be to impose capital gains tax on house price sales, because that's the one way I can think of that you might have a huge shift away from the kind of economy we've had in the past. But would it be acceptable to people?
It's difficult to see that it would be acceptable anytime soon. And let me clarify, I think a lot of what's in the Common Weal proposal is admirable and intellectually honest in that it acknowledges there would have to be higher taxes, something which is rarely acknowledged in anything the SNP says, much of what Labour says and beyond that. And so it is very important, but as you say, the practicality of it is something altogether different. And any tax changes, any major revision of the tax system, however intellectually justified, is a huge undertaking. And I just don't think the political appetite is there, and specifically I don't think the political appetite is there in the SNP. I hate to be cynical, but I suspect what the SNP will do is discuss this at their away day, they'll debate it at conference, they'll subscribe to the general concept, perhaps some of the policy aims, but they won't bite the bullet on tax, and that's where the whole thing flounders, I think.
I think one of the issues we have, Gordon, is that we have the need for the Yes and the Better Together camps in the run-up to next year's referendum to articulate a proper vision for Scotland and to paint some of the key characteristics of what a future Scotland might look like. But the parties involved in both of those campaigns need to save something for the 2016 Scottish election. And it's that differentiation between the referendum on the one hand and then the election on the other hand. And I think it's that period when we'll see some of the meat coming out and people being a bit more brave, because they have to, because the public expenditure profile at that point in time will be at its very lowest.
Before we move on, I'm curious as to what your expectations. I mean, you've got this invitation, haven't you? Mm-hmm. What are your expectations or hopes?
Well, I mean, the first thing I'd say is that I am utterly confident that this reflects the democratic will of Scotland. I have no doubt that strong public services, better jobs and better pay reflects what Scotland wants. We're living in a low-pay economy and people aren't happy with it. My strong belief is that the political party which puts this together in a coherent and sensible way is going to sweep a lot of support up behind it. And I'm firmly of the view that it's a matter of time. We can't keep going on like this. We can't keep with a failing low-pay economy on the basis of cheap inward investment jobs which don't put real investment into the Scottish economy. It's going to change. It can't go on like this. And I think, from my readings of what's been happening in a lot of the political parties at grassroots and all the way up, there's a very strong demand, a very strong will for something better than this. So I wouldn't write off our chances of getting a rapid take-up on this quite as quickly.
The other obvious point to make about some of the things you say in this document is that, arguably, you've missed what's actually happening in Scandinavia at the moment. that in Scandinavia at the moment, the big debate is not, in fact, how to expand public services. That all of the parties there have realised that without radical change, the welfare, the social insurance system that they've built up can't go on. And in fact, there have been enormous changes to the welfare system, for example, in Sweden, probably more radical than anything proposed by Ian Duncan Smith. They've kept the universality of it, I'll grant you, but there are enormous changes. And they've used that social consensus to do something you don't talk about in your document at all, which is radical reform of the public services. I mean, in Sweden and Denmark, for example, the idea of giving to private companies sections of public service to run, they're still free at the point of use, has gone much further, probably even than it has in the United States of America.
There's been a sharp swing to the right in a lot of the Nordic countries in the last 10 years. There's no doubt about that. And it has gone that way. That's what's happened. But that's from a very high base. They have incredibly strong public services. And one thing which is absolutely the case is left or right in the spectrum in the Nordic countries, none of them want to go to a low-pay, unproductive economy with poor public services.
OK, but that's slightly missing the point. The point I was trying to get at, Ross Martin, is there an argument that, in a way, the argument for Robin McAlpin is you have this system of social consensus, but what they can do with that, because it's there, is do these radical reforms. If you propose radical reforms in the NHS in Britain, for example, you're immediately accused of dismantling it and there's a huge fight. Whereas there are vast swathes of hospitals in Sweden that are now run by the private sector. They're run on behalf of the public sector. In Denmark, I mean, just the kind of scale of this, you get vouchers from the state to send your children to private school, and you can top them up with your own money. Labour laws in Denmark are freer than they are in the United States. It's easier to fire someone in Denmark than it is in the USA.
There are a couple of real structural differences between those comparisons that you make. So in Denmark, for example, 87% of the national budget is devolved down to the local level. So that would mean in Scotland, then the cities, for example, taking on much more responsibility and taking welfare.
But the other side of it is you can fire people easier than you can in America. But the flip side of that, of course, is the state is the Robin McAlpin point. Is the state takes care of you if you're fired and helps you get another job.
Absolutely. But the way that you procure and then deliver public services can be changed in Scotland. It doesn't need absolute conservative consensus, if you like. It needs a willingness to try out different things, to drive innovation through the system, and to essentially turn upside down the current arrangement where local authorities provide everything through schools, and schools are delivery arms for local authorities. Local authorities need to turn their view round and be the support mechanism for much more autonomous organisations through head teachers. I want to
hear David Torrance's views on that, because is there a sense in which what Ross Martin says may or may not be true, but this also just misses the kind of debate that's actually going on in Scandinavia. We're in danger of proposing for Scotland a sort of idealised Scandinavia, which last existed round about 1975, and then most of the Scandinavian countries went into severe crisis.
Yeah, we do, I say we, the royal we collectively tend to fetishise certain Scandinavian countries, and that's understandable to a point. They achieved significant and lasting things in the post-war era, but then so did the UK once upon a time. And I do get frustrated that we have this sort of cherry-picking approach. We can take the best bits from different countries. We can be more like Norway. At one point, Alex Salmond even said we could be more like Australia. And surely the point of independence is doing something distinctly Scottish, whatever that means. But I still think a lot of this comes down to the eternal optimism of the Scottish left, of assuming these things will happen and assuming public support, and little evidence that's actually the case.
All right, well, thank you all very much indeed. Quick look at tomorrow's front pages, starting with the Herald. Have we got the Herald? There it is. There's a picture of my colleague Sally Magnuson showing her frustration with some technical problems we had earlier. And the headline is, Cameron turns up heat on Muirfield in men only row, it says. The Times, BBC chiefs broke rules over golden handshakes. It says scandal of how inflated payoffs were fixed. The Guardian, May warned over police cuts. It says 5 forces at the limit of austerity. This is police forces in England. And the Daily Telegraph, Blair warned, that's a heat-related picture, by the way, at the top there. Blair warned he will be criticised in Iraq report. And that's all for this week. We'll be back on Monday. Good night.